Hey guys, before starting the video, just want to say that if you enjoy the video, hit that like button. And also, if you have any suggestions regarding the videos, comment down below, as it helps me to improve the videos. Thank you so much. Enjoy.
The sea is never truly silent. Even when the winds die down and the waves seem calm, if you listen closely, you can hear it whisper, a low, endless murmur, like a voice that has been speaking for thousands of years. Tonight, we lean in to hear that voice, to follow the whispers that drift across the dark waters of the ancient Mediterranean. For these whispers speak of a people both feared and forgotten, raiders, wanderers, exiles, and destroyers. They came without warning, their sails like storm clouds on the horizon, their ships gliding like shadows. To the kingdoms of old, they were terror itself. To us, they remain a mystery. They are remembered by one haunting name: the Sea Peoples. Imagine it. The year is around 1200 BC. Across the ancient world, mighty kingdoms stand proud. Egypt glitters with gold beneath its pharaohs. The Hittite Empire commands vast lands of stone fortresses. The cities of Canaan thrive with merchants and ships. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece echo with warriors and kings. Civilization feels eternal, unshakable. But from the dark horizon, a new sound begins to rise. The sound of paddles cutting through water. The sound of war cries carried on salt and wind. Whispers from the waves, a warning that everything is about to change. The Sea Peoples did not announce themselves with kings or treaties. They appeared suddenly, as if the sea itself had given birth to them. No one knew exactly where they came from. Some said from distant islands beyond the horizon. Others believed they were exiles, pushed from their homelands by famine or war. All that mattered to the people of the great kingdoms was what they brought with them: fire, steel, and chaos. Picture standing on a quiet shore at dawn. The mist is heavy, and you hear nothing but gulls and waves. Then, out of the fog, black ships begin to emerge. Strange prows carved like beasts, sails striped and unfamiliar. The ground beneath your feet begins to tremble as men with bronze weapons pour onto the sand. Their voices are strange, their armor unlike anything you've seen. For the people who faced them, it must have felt like the end of the world had arrived on the tide. But who were these people really? Their name, the Sea Peoples, was not what they called themselves. It was a name given by their enemies, written on broken tablets and carved into temple walls. The Egyptians, perhaps the greatest record keepers of the ancient world, left us fragments of their story. On the walls of Pharaoh Ramses III's temple at Medinet Habu, great battles are shown in carved relief. Ships colliding, warriors fighting hand to hand, women and children in oxen-drawn carts trailing behind. The Sea Peoples were not just raiders, they were whole nations on the move. Families, belongings, entire communities carried across the sea, searching for a new home, or perhaps seizing one by force. This is part of what makes them so haunting. They were not simply pirates or mercenaries. They were refugees as well as conquerors. Imagine the desperation of leaving everything behind: fields, houses, even ancestors' graves, and pushing out to sea, not knowing if land would ever welcome you again. The Sea Peoples carried both hunger and fury in their sails. And when they arrived, they changed history forever. Archaeologists have tried for decades to trace their origins. Some believe they came from the Aegean Islands, pushed away by earthquakes and famine. Others think they were from Italy, Sardinia, or even the Black Sea. The truth may be that they were many peoples, united only by the sea itself. Their names survive in Egyptian records: the Shurden, the Shekelesh, the Peleset, the Denyen. Names that sound faintly familiar, as if we've heard their echoes elsewhere. The Peleset, for example, are believed by many to be the ancestors of the Philistines, who later settled on the coast of Canaan. Each group may have had its own story, its own reason for leaving, but together they became a storm. Close your eyes and imagine their world. The smell of salt mixed with smoke, the creak of wooden hulls under pressure, the cries of children huddled beneath rough sails while warriors sharpened blades at the prow. To the kingdoms of the Mediterranean, these travelers looked like destroyers. But within their ships lived hope, too. The hope of survival, of finding a new land, of carving out a future. The kingdoms they attacked had grown wealthy and proud, their palaces glittering but fragile. The sea people struck like lightning against this world. They burned cities along the coast of Anatolia. They swept down into Canaan. They even dared to challenge the pharaohs of Egypt. To the Egyptians, they were an existential threat. A carved inscription tells us, "No land could stand before their arms." Think of that, an entire coalition of wandering nations so fierce that even the greatest empires trembled at their coming. And yet, despite their power, they remain shrouded in silence. We have no records written by their own hands, no songs or stories that survive. Everything we know comes from their enemies, from the kings who fought them, the scribes who cursed them, the temples that depicted them as monsters. To us, they are whispers, ghosts carried on the waves, half seen, half understood. Still, those whispers linger. Archaeology has uncovered clues, fragments of pottery that look out of place, strange weapons buried far from their homelands, skeletons with marks of battle. Step by step, the sea peoples are emerging from the shadows of history. But even now, they refuse to give us all their secrets. What made them move in such numbers? Was it famine, earthquake, drought, or perhaps a chain reaction, one kingdom falling and pushing its neighbors into flight until the whole Mediterranean was set in motion? And this is where the story becomes even stranger. For as much as the sea peoples destroyed, they also created. They helped end the Bronze Age, yes, but from its ruins, the Iron Age was born. New cultures rose where old empires had fallen. The Philistines, once feared as invaders, became part of the fabric of the land they settled. Trade routes shifted, languages blended, and the world moved forward in ways it never could without them. In their shadows, we find the beginnings of the world we know today. The sea keeps many secrets. Ships sink, shores change, names are forgotten. But every now and then, a whisper rises from the waves, reminding us that even the forgotten can leave a mark too deep to erase. The sea peoples are not gone. They live on in ruins, in myths, in the very shape of history itself. As we step into their story, remember that this is not just the tale of raiders or invaders. It is the tale of human survival, of what happens when the earth shifts beneath our feet and we are forced to move, to fight, to adapt. It is the story of people who became shadows on the sea and whose whispers still reach us thousands of years later. The waves are quiet now, but the journey has only just begun. For beyond the whispers lies the question that has haunted historians for centuries. Where did these people truly come from? Were they children of distant islands, castaways from broken kingdoms, or something else entirely? To answer that, we must leave the shoreline and travel back, across forgotten waters, to the lands that may have birthed them.
The sea is endless. It stretches farther than the eye can see, swallowing the horizon in silver and blue. But every sea has its shores. Some are alive with cities and markets, others lie empty, abandoned, marked only by ruins and broken stones. It is to these forgotten shores that we now turn. For if the sea peoples came from anywhere, it was from these silent coastlines, edges of the world that time itself has tried to erase. Close your eyes and picture it, an ancient beach long before history was written. The sand is dark, the waves heavy with foam. Behind the shore, cliffs rise, dotted with caves and wind-bent trees. You hear gulls circling overhead, smell the salt mixed with pine, and feel the wind pressing against your skin. These forgotten places were once alive with voices, with laughter, with the sound of hammers and sails. But one by one, the voices fell silent. All that remains is the echo, and it is from those echoes that the sea peoples began their journey. The truth is, no one knows exactly where they came from. That mystery is part of what makes them so haunting. But clues have been scattered like seashells along the coastlines of the Mediterranean. Archaeologists dig in Sardinia, in Sicily, in the islands of the Aegean, and in the ruins of Cyprus. Each shard of pottery, each strange weapon, each burned city offers a whisper of their origin. And those whispers always point to the shores, the edge places, the in-between lands where survival was never guaranteed. Some believe they came from the Aegean Islands, a world of cliffs and harbors shaken by earthquakes and fire. Around 1200 BC, this region suffered disaster after disaster. Palaces collapsed, farms turned to dust, people packed up what little they had and fled. Imagine families pushing boats into the water, sails patched with cloth, their eyes fixed on the horizon. When you have lost your land, the sea becomes your only road. Others look to the western Mediterranean, Sardinia, Corsica, and even Italy. There, too, ancient tribes were restless, their lands shaken by change. From these shores, warriors could have sailed eastward, searching for wealth or a new beginning. Their ships might have carried bronze-tipped spears, round shields, and strange horned helmets, the kind carved into Egyptian walls. These images of foreign warriors with their unique armor and weapons may be the clearest glimpse we have of who they were. But not all was war. These forgotten shores were places of trade. Imagine the markets, amphorae of wine and oil, baskets of grain, ivory from Africa, tin from far northern lands. The sea was a highway, and those who lived on its edges were sailors by necessity. They knew the stars, the winds, the currents. For them to leave shore was as natural as planting seed or building fire.
It is no wonder that when crisis struck, these people took to the waves. Think of the chain reaction. A drought in one land leads to famine. A famine pushes people into their neighbor's territory. Wars break out, cities burn, and with each fire, another group is displaced, forced to sail onward in search of a safer place. By the time the Sea Peoples appeared on the coasts of Egypt and Canaan, they may have already been wandering for generations. Their homelands were not one shore, but many, scattered across the wide circle of the Mediterranean, each forgotten by history, each echoing with loss. Archaeology reveals this story in fragments. In Cyprus, layers of ash mark cities that were destroyed around 1200 BC. In the Aegean, palaces of the once mighty Mycenaeans lie in ruins. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire collapses, its capital abandoned. These are the scars of the Bronze Age collapse, a time when the world seemed to unravel all at once. And in the center of that unraveling were the Sea Peoples, both a symptom of the collapse and a force that made it worse. But picture it not just as destruction, picture it as desperation. Imagine mothers carrying children on their hips, men hauling carts filled with whatever they could salvage, priests carrying sacred idols to protect them across the sea. These were not faceless hordes, but human beings. People who loved, who feared, who dreamed. Their story begins not with conquest, but with the forgotten shores where survival was no longer possible. Let us walk those shores for a moment. In the distance, you see the ruins of a palace, its walls toppled by earthquake. The air smells of ash from fires that burned seasons ago. You hear only the wind moving through broken stone. This once was a center of life, but now the people are gone. Follow their trail and you find the sea. Their ships wait, carved from cedar, patched with rope, heavy with supplies. They do not know where the waves will take them, but they know they cannot stay. And so they push off, leaving behind another forgotten shore. This moment, this act of leaving, is the true beginning of the Sea People's journey. It is what turns them from isolated tribes into something greater. The sea becomes their common ground, their unifier, their weapon. Every forgotten shore adds another thread to the tapestry. Sardinians, Aegeans, Anatolians, even wandering bands from Italy, all may have joined together. The forgotten shores became a network, a launching point for the storm that would sweep across empires. And yet those empires would remember them only as invaders. Egypt carved their likeness into stone, showing horned helmets and feathered crests. To the pharaohs, they were chaos. To the Hittites, they were ruin. To the cities of Canaan, they were terror. But behind those depictions, behind the fear and the hatred, lies a more complicated truth. They were people searching for survival. The forgotten shores had pushed them into the waves, and the waves had carried them into history. Why does this matter? Because history is not just about kings and battles. It is about the forces that drive people to move, to fight, to rebuild. The Sea Peoples remind us that migration is as old as humanity, that desperation can turn farmers into sailors, and sailors into warriors, and that sometimes the places we leave behind, the forgotten shores, shape us more than the places we find. When you listen to the whispers of the Sea Peoples, you hear not only war drums, but also the cry of the displaced, the wandering, the lost. And when you stand on a quiet beach today, with only the waves and the gulls for company, you may feel their presence. Somewhere beneath the sand lies a shard of pottery, a fragment of a life uprooted, a memory of someone who once stood where you stand now, staring out to sea, waiting for the wind. The forgotten shores are not gone. They live in ruins, in broken walls, in the silence of abandoned harbors. They live in the questions we still cannot answer. And they live in the story of what came next. For once these people left their shores behind, they did not stop. They became a wave rolling across the Mediterranean, toppling kingdoms and reshaping history. And so the sea grows darker. The sails fill with wind. The whispers grow louder. Ahead lies Egypt, Canaan, and the great empires of the Bronze Age, unaware that their world is about to be tested like never before. The whispers from the waves have led us to their beginning. Now the storm itself is about to break.
The horizon is quiet, too quiet. The sky is painted gold by the setting sun, and the waves roll softly against the shore. But far out, beyond the reach of sight, something stirs, a shadow, a movement, a storm building not in the clouds, but on the sea itself. The people of the great kingdoms cannot see it yet, but they can feel it. Farmers pause in their fields as the wind shifts. Fishermen glance nervously at the horizon. Priests whisper to their gods, sensing that something vast is coming. This is the moment before history breaks, the moment before the storm. The sea peoples had left their forgotten shores, carrying with them hunger, fire, and desperation. They were no longer wanderers looking for a home. They had become a tide, gathering strength with every mile of coastline they touched. Small raids grew into great fleets. What began as whispers was now a roar. And as the horizon darkened with sails, the mighty empires of the Bronze Age, the Egyptians, the Hittites, the cities of Canaan, and the Mycenaean Greeks, realized they were standing in the path of a storm unlike any they had faced before. Imagine standing guard on a city wall at night. The moon hangs over the water, silver and calm. Then, suddenly you hear it. The faint splash of oars, the distant creak of wood, voices carried on the wind. At first it seems impossible, but then the horizon flickers with fire. Ships, dozens of them, sliding across the waves, their sails glowing in the torchlight. The storm is no longer distant, it is here. The sea peoples struck suddenly, like lightning. Towns that had stood for centuries went up in flames. Coastal villages were raided, their people scattered. Fortresses that had once seemed unbreakable crumbled beneath the assault of wave after wave of attackers. These were not random acts of piracy. They were coordinated, determined, unstoppable. Entire fleets descended on coastlines, bringing with them not just warriors, but families, wagons, and supplies. This was migration turned into invasion. But why now? What pushed these people to rise like a storm at this moment in history? Scholars debate the answer, but one thing is clear. The world of the Bronze Age was already beginning to unravel. Drought stretched across the land, killing crops and livestock. Earthquakes shook the Aegean, toppling palaces. Trade routes faltered as kingdoms grew weak. When one empire fell, it sent shockwaves to the next. And into this chaos sailed the sea peoples. Their arrival as much symptom as cause, but no less devastating. Picture the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC. It is a web of glittering powers. The Hittites control Anatolia, their capital Hattusa filled with stone lions and carved gates. The Egyptians thrive under their pharaohs, their cities glittering with gold and temples towering toward the sky. In Greece, the Mycenaeans rule from their fortified palaces, their kings draped in bronze armor. Along the coast of Canaan, small city-states grow rich from trade. It seems like a world of stability, of permanence. But just beyond the horizon, the storm gathers. The Sea Peoples were masters of surprise. They struck when least expected, slipping past defenses, burning fields, destroying storehouses. They disrupted the delicate balance of trade and trust that held the Bronze Age together. And once one kingdom was shaken, others began to fall. It was like pulling a single thread from a tapestry. Soon, the whole fabric unraveled. Imagine the panic, families fleeing with what little they could carry, kings sending desperate pleas for aid to allies who were themselves under attack, entire towns abandoned overnight, left to rot in silence. The storm did not just take lives, it stole certainty. It broke the illusion that the great empires were eternal. But the storm was not just destruction, it was also creation. The Sea Peoples carried their families with them, their carts filled with belongings. They were not content with raids alone. They wanted land, settlements, a place to rebuild. When they swept through the Mediterranean, they were searching for more than gold. They were searching for a future. And if that meant tearing down the old world, so be it. Egypt's records show us glimpses of this storm. Pharaohs inscribed on their temple walls that no land could stand before them. Their reliefs depict waves of warriors in strange armor, ships clashing in chaotic battle, and long trains of families following behind. These were not just soldiers, they were whole nations on the move, determined to carve out a new life at any cost. Let's pause for a moment and imagine one of those ships. The air is heavy with salt, the deck crowded with men and women. Warriors sit sharpening their blades, the bronze glinting in the sun. Children huddle near the mast, clutching wooden toys. Smoke rises from a small fire where bread is baking. The waves slap against the hull, steady and endless. Ahead, the horizon looms. Another shore, another raid, another chance at survival. For those on board, this storm was not chaos. It was life. The storm on the horizon grew so fierce that it toppled even the mightiest. The Hittite Empire, which had stood for centuries, collapsed in a single generation. Its cities were burned, its people scattered. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece crumbled, their kings forgotten. Along the coast of Canaan, city after city fell. The storm swept across the map, leaving ash and silence in its wake. And yet, even in destruction, there is creation. The storm of the Sea Peoples tore down the Bronze Age world, but it also cleared the way for something new. In the ruins of old empires, new cultures emerged. The Philistines, believed to be one branch of the Sea Peoples, settled along the coast of Canaan, building cities of their own. The collapse of trade routes forced people to adapt, giving rise to new forms of society, new technologies, and eventually, the Iron Age itself. The storm destroyed, but it also transformed. For those who lived through it, though, it must have felt like the end of days. Imagine being a farmer in Canaan, waking to see sails blotting out the horizon, or a soldier in a Hittite fortress, hearing the clash of bronze outside your gates, or a child in Greece watching fire consume the only home you've ever known.
For them, the storm was not just history, it was terror, raw and immediate. But the storm did not last forever. Like all storms, it had its rise, its peak, and its breaking point. The greatest test came when the sea people set their sights on Egypt itself, the jewel of the ancient world, the last great stronghold that still stood. It was there, on the banks of the Nile, that the storm would face its fiercest resistance. The horizon grows darker, the sails draw nearer. Egypt waits, its pharaohs ready to defend their land. The sea peoples, the storm of the Bronze Age, are about to meet their greatest battle. The storm has risen, and soon it will break.
The Nile had always been eternal. Its waters flowed steadily, feeding the fields, sustaining the people, and guarding the power of Egypt for thousands of years. The pharaohs, crowned in gold and wrapped in divine authority, believed their kingdom was unshakable. Egypt had faced droughts, rebellions, even invasions before, and always endured. But this time, something different was coming. Not a single army, not a lone uprising, but a storm that stretched across the horizon. The Sea Peoples. For the first time in centuries, Egypt trembled. The pharaohs, once gods on earth, now stood in peril. Picture the Nile Delta at dawn. The air is heavy with mist, the smell of wet reeds drifting from the marshes. Fishermen paddle their boats silently, unaware that beyond the waves, sails are rising like dark wings. Soon, the horizon will be filled with them, ships carrying warriors, families, entire nations moving toward Egypt's shores. To the Egyptians, these strangers were more than enemies. They were chaos itself, threatening the very order of the world. By the time the Sea Peoples reached Egypt, they had already swept through the Mediterranean like wildfire. They had toppled the Hittites, burned cities along the coast of Canaan, and struck fear into every kingdom they touched. The pharaohs knew they were next. Carvings from the great temple of Medinet Habu, built by Pharaoh Ramses III, tell the story in chilling detail. Reliefs show strange ships with curved prows, warriors wearing horned helmets and feathered headdresses. Behind them, ox-drawn carts carry women and children. This was no simple raid. It was an invasion. Imagine the fear in Egypt's royal court. The pharaoh and his advisors gathered in torchlit chambers, their voices hushed but urgent. Messengers arrived breathless, reporting fires along the coast, foreign warriors cutting down villages, and strange ships landing in the delta. Egypt had faced foreign powers before, the Libyans, the Nubians, even the mighty Hittites. But this was different. This was not a single army with a single leader. It was a wave of many peoples, united only by hunger, desperation, and the sea. And yet, Egypt was not defenseless. The pharaohs had prepared for centuries to face threats both within and beyond their borders. Ramses III, the last of the warrior kings, rose to meet the storm. He gathered his armies, archers, charioteers, infantry, lined the delta with defenses, and prepared the navy for battle. The Nile would not surrender easily. Let us step onto the battlefield as the Egyptians might have seen it. The sea churns with ships, their sails striped, their warriors shouting in strange tongues. The air is heavy with pitch and smoke, the crack of oars, the cries of children hidden in carts along the shore. Egyptian archers line the banks of the Nile, their bows raised, arrows gleaming in the sun. Chariots thunder across the sand,
wheels grinding against stone. The clash is immense, a storm of bronze, wood, and fire. The Sea Peoples had strength, but Egypt had strategy. Ramses III used the delta itself as a weapon. Narrow channels trapped the invading ships. Egyptian vessels surrounded them, ramming their hulls and showering them with arrows. On land, chariots cut through their ranks, while infantry closed in. Reliefs carved into the temple walls showed desperate scenes. Ships overturning, warriors falling into the water, arrows raining from above. The storm that had brought down so many kingdoms was meeting its first wall. But it was not easy. Egypt suffered too. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, lives lost. The people must have wondered if even the Nile, eternal and unyielding, could withstand this tide. Yet in the end, Egypt held. The Sea Peoples were beaten back, their advance halted at the very edge of the Nile. For a moment, the pharaohs had turned the tide. And yet, victory did not mean safety. The battle was won, but Egypt was forever changed. The reliefs of Medinet Habu are triumphant, showing Ramses III as the conquering pharaoh. But behind the carved stone, the reality was darker. Egypt had survived, but only just. Its resources were drained, its borders weakened, its people weary. The storm had not toppled Egypt, but it had shaken its foundations. Think about what this meant for the Egyptians. For centuries, they had believed their pharaohs were divine, chosen by the gods to keep order in the world. To admit fear, to acknowledge peril, was almost unthinkable. Yet, the Sea Peoples had forced that reality upon them. They were not fighting mere enemies. They were fighting the collapse of an age. What makes this moment so powerful is that it was both an end and a beginning. The end of Egypt's unquestioned dominance, the end of the Bronze Age world, but also the beginning of something new, the Iron Age, when new peoples, new technologies, and new powers would rise from the ruins. Even in their defeat, the Sea Peoples left a mark on Egypt, carving themselves into its story forever. Close your eyes and picture the Nile after the battle. The waters are littered with broken ships, their sails torn, their hulls splintered. Arrows float among the reeds. The cries of the wounded mix with the calls of birds overhead. The storm has passed, but the scars remain. Egypt breathes, still alive, but forever changed. And perhaps the most haunting part is this. The Sea Peoples were not completely destroyed. Some groups, like the Peleset, settled along the coast of Canaan, becoming the people we know as the Philistines. Others vanished into history, their names surviving only in Egyptian inscriptions. They may have lost the battle for Egypt, but their journey was not over. Their presence would continue to shape the lands they touched. The pharaohs had survived their peril, but the world around them was collapsing. Allies were gone, trade routes broken, old powers crumbled into dust. Egypt stood like a lone island in a sea of chaos. The storm had been beaten back, but its echoes still roared across the Mediterranean. This is what makes the story of the Sea Peoples so gripping. They were not just destroyers. They were catalysts. They forced the old world to break, and from its ruins a new world would rise. The pharaohs, once eternal, had faced their greatest peril. They had endured, but the age of gods in golden palaces was drawing to a close. And as Egypt looked out across the Mediterranean, smoke still rising from distant shores, they must have wondered, what would come next? The storm had battered the pharaohs, but it was not finished. It would sweep onward, toppling cities, leaving ruins in its wake. And so, as Egypt rebuilt, the rest of the Mediterranean burned.
The night sky glowed red, not from the sun, not from the stars, but from fire. The smell of smoke carried for miles, ash rained down like snow, clinging to hair and skin, choking the breath of those who fled. Across the Mediterranean world, one city after another was swallowed by flames. Great walls that had stood for centuries cracked and fell. Palaces collapsed into rubble. The proud centers of trade, power, and culture were reduced to smoldering ruins. For the people of the ancient world, it must have felt like the end of everything they had ever known. This was the true terror of the sea peoples, the storm that swept across the coasts, not just raiding villages, but burning entire civilizations. Imagine being a child in one of those cities. You wake to the sound of shouting in the streets, to the thunder of feet against stone, to the scream of metal on metal. You run to the window and see fire rising over the rooftops, strange warriors rushing through the gates, their faces fierce, their weapons gleaming. The air burns in your lungs as your world collapses before your eyes. This was not a single tragedy. It was a chain reaction, a wave of destruction stretching from Anatolia to Greece, from Canaan to Cyprus. The fall of cities is written in the earth itself. Archaeologists dig down into layers of soil and find the same story repeated. Blackened stone, broken pottery, arrowheads buried in ash. The evidence of sudden, violent destruction. In Anatolia, the mighty capital of the Hittites, Hattusa, was abandoned, its walls left to crumble. In Greece, the palaces of Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns burned, their once mighty kings forgotten. In Cyprus, towns like Enkomi were destroyed, their treasures buried beneath rubble. It was as though the map of the Bronze Age had been set on fire. But fire is more than destruction. Fire is a message. Each burning city sent a warning to the next. People fled in terror, carrying tales of strange invaders with horned helmets and feathered crests, of ships that arrived like shadows, of armies that fought with desperation and fury. Word spread faster than the flames. For the survivors, there was no doubt. The sea peoples were unstoppable. Imagine standing on the walls of a city as the invaders approach. The ground shakes with the beat of their march. Their ships crowd the harbor, dark against the water. Their voices rise in chants you cannot understand. You hear the crash of the first battering ram against your gate. The smell of burning pitch fills the air. Behind you, families huddle in fear. Priests pray to the gods. Soldiers grip their spears with trembling hands. You know the walls will not hold forever. The fire is coming. But not every city fell without a fight. Some resisted with all their strength. The reliefs of Egypt show battles fought on land and sea, desperate clashes where entire fleets collided, where arrows blackened the sky. In Canaan, fortified towns resisted for days, perhaps weeks, before finally succumbing, and yet even the strongest could not withstand the storm forever. The Sea Peoples did not come to raid and leave. They came to stay. They came with their families, their carts, their entire way of life. They were not seeking treasure alone. They were seeking land. That is what makes this wave of destruction different from the countless raids of history. These were not passing invaders. They were settlers, reshaping the very map of the Mediterranean. When they burned cities, it was not always to destroy, but sometimes to clear the way for themselves. From the ashes, they built new lives. From the ruins, they carved new identities. In the smoke of destruction, a new world was taking shape. Still, for those who lived through it, the pain was unbearable. Think of a merchant in Ugarit, the great port city of Syria. His warehouses are filled with grain, his docks crowded with ships. Then, in a single night, it is all gone. Flames devour the city, the ships sink into the harbor, and his family is lost in the chaos. Or a farmer in Cyprus, watching the fields he planted go up in smoke, the only home he has ever known reduced to ash. These personal stories, though unwritten, are the beating heart of this collapse. They remind us that behind every burned city were lives shattered, families shattered, hopes destroyed. The destruction was so widespread, so complete, that historians call this period the Bronze Age collapse, a time when the old world unraveled all at once. Some scholars argue it was not only the Sea Peoples who caused it. Famine and earthquakes and internal wars all played a role. But the Sea Peoples were the spark that turned crisis into catastrophe. Wherever they went, fire followed. Let us walk through the ruins together. The city is silent now, its streets choked with ash. A toppled statue lies half-buried, its face broken. In the distance, blackened walls lean against one another like skeletons. The air is heavy with the scent of charred wood, even centuries later. Archaeologists dig here, carefully lifting shards of pottery, broken tools, and the remains of burned homes. Each fragment is a whisper of the people who once lived here, a reminder that this city, now forgotten, once thrived with life before it was swept away by fire. The pattern is unmistakable. From Anatolia to Greece, from Cyprus to Canaan, the same destruction marks the same years. Entire cultures collapsed within a generation. Trade routes that had connected the Mediterranean for centuries vanished. Writing systems disappeared. Knowledge was lost. The lights of civilization dimmed. And in the shadows, the Sea Peoples pressed forward. And yet, as strange as it may seem, there is a kind of rebirth in this destruction. The old powers had grown brittle, their palaces heavy with wealth, but vulnerable to change. When they burned, new opportunities rose from the ashes. Smaller kingdoms emerged, new languages spread, new technologies like iron tools and weapons began to dominate. The Iron Age was born, not in peace, but in fire. For the survivors, though, this was little comfort. To them, the Sea Peoples were monsters, destroyers of worlds. Egypt described them as a scourge that swept the land.
The ruins of Greece tell of a dark age where memory itself seemed to vanish. The cities in flames were not just places, they were symbols of an entire way of life that was disappearing. And yet, we must remember, the Sea Peoples were also human. They carried their families with them, their belongings piled high on wagons. They sang songs we no longer know, prayed to gods whose names are forgotten, and dreamed of homes they might one day build. The flames they left behind were the price they paid for survival. As the fires spread, the Mediterranean world was remade. The old empires crumbled, and new powers rose. The storm was far from over. Ahead lay more battles, more migrations, more transformations. The cities burned, the skies glowed red, and the world trembled. But out of the ashes, new voices would rise, new cultures, new peoples, new histories. The cities are in flames, and as the smoke clears, we turn to the next chapter in the story, the long march of wandering nations across.
Picture this. The horizon is lined with sails, dozens, maybe hundreds of ships pushing forward across the sea. Their wooden hulls groan against the waves. The air smells of salt, tar, and smoke from cooking fires carried on board. Children cry. Animals shuffle restlessly in makeshift pens on the decks. Men and women cling to what little they own: pots, tools, family relics, stacked high in the cramped space of the vessels. This is not a fleet going to war. This is a people on the move. Entire nations, uprooted, sailing across the Mediterranean in desperate search of survival. It is a migration so vast, so powerful, that it reshaped the map of the ancient world. And it all began in the chaos left behind by fire and famine. The Bronze Age had collapsed. Cities lay in ruins, their walls blackened and broken. Farmlands were abandoned, fields turned to dust. Trade networks that once brought grain, copper, and tin across the seas had vanished. Without trade, kings could not feed their armies. Without armies, kingdoms could not stand. The old world crumbled, leaving millions to fend for themselves. So the people moved, first in small groups, then in great waves. Families packed what little they could carry. Carts creaked under the weight of supplies. Herds of goats and sheep were driven forward. The elderly leaned on sticks, while children stumbled beside them, clutching their mothers' robes. Behind them, the only home they had ever known disappeared into memory. Ahead of them lay only uncertainty, the sea, the mountains, and the faint hope of a new beginning. But where did they come from? The truth is, no one knows for certain. Some came from the Aegean Islands, some from the coast of Anatolia, others from the heart of Europe. The Egyptians called them by strange names: the Shurdan, the Peliset, the Shekelish, the Denyen, the Chikar. Each name hints at a people once rooted in a homeland, now adrift across the waves. For many, hunger was the driving force. Famine had swept across the eastern Mediterranean. Crops failed, rains faltered, and the land could no longer sustain its people. Others were pushed out by war. Rival tribes, collapsing kingdoms, and internal revolts made entire regions unlivable. Imagine waking one morning to find your home surrounded by enemies, your fields burned, your village too dangerous to stay. You would have no choice but to leave. Multiply that by thousands, even tens of thousands, and you begin to see the scale of the migrations. The sight must have been extraordinary. A caravan of ships, filled not only with warriors, but with families, animals, and everything needed to start again. On the decks, fires burned in clay hearths, sending smoke into the air. Mothers sang softly to calm their children. Men sharpened their spears and kept watch on the horizon. The sea carried the sounds of life, the bleating of goats, the clang of bronze tools, the murmur of prayers whispered to forgotten gods. Each dawn the ships rose with the tide, sails billowing in the wind. Each night they pulled ashore to rest. Fires lit up the beaches, casting flickering shadows against the rocks. Food was scarce, meals were simple, dried grain, smoked fish, whatever they could gather. Yet even in hardship, there was hope. They were searching for a place to belong. Some found it. The Sherdans settled along the coasts of Sardinia and Corsica, leaving behind towers of stone that still stand today. The Peliset landed on the shores of Canaan, where they would one day be known as the Philistines, the rivals of ancient Israel. Others, like the Checker and the Denyen, pressed deeper into the Levant, carving out new homes from the ruins of old ones. Each migration left a mark, not only in conquest, but in culture, new pottery, new weapons, new gods blending with the old. But the migrations were not peaceful. Wherever they went, the sea peoples clashed with the locals. Cities already weakened by famine and war could not withstand the pressure. Some fell to fire, others were abandoned. To the native peoples, the newcomers were invaders, tearing apart what little stability remained. To the migrants, they were survivors, fighting for a place to live. Both saw themselves as right. Both saw the other as a threat. This is the paradox of the great migrations. They were both tragedy and renewal. For every city burned, another settlement was founded. For every life lost, another was reborn in a new land. History is rarely neat. It is made of both endings and beginnings, woven together by people searching for survival. Egypt recorded this chapter with fear and pride. Their reliefs show waves of migrants pressing against their borders, carts pulled by oxen, women and children alongside warriors. Pharaoh's scribes describe them as nations coming from the sea, vast armies of displaced peoples seeking to conquer or settle the fertile Nile Delta. To Egypt, they were a threat unlike any other. Not just enemies, but entire civilizations on the move. And yet even Egypt could not stop the tide completely. Some groups were defeated, yes, but others were absorbed. Some became mercenaries in the Pharaoh's army. Others settled in Egyptian lands, contributing their skills and traditions. What began as invasion ended as integration. The sea peoples were not erased. They became part of the story. Archaeology confirms their footprints. In Sardinia, mysterious stone towers known as nuraghe appear, likely linked to the Sherdan. In Canaan, Philistine pottery show Aegean designs, proof of their journey across the sea. In Cyprus, Burned cities were rebuilt with foreign styles of architecture. The fingerprints of migration are everywhere, in artifacts, in ruins, in the blending of languages and traditions. The migrations were not a single moment. They unfolded over decades, even centuries. Families settled, grew, and spread. Children born on the journey grew into adults who had never known the homeland of their parents. Their identity was not tied to where they had come from, but to where they had arrived. Out of this movement, new cultures were born. Think about that for a moment. The migrations were not only about loss, they were about reinvention. People carried their memories, their songs, their gods, and planted them in new soil. Over time, those seeds grew into something different. New societies, new traditions, new stories. The Mediterranean we know today, the mixture of cultures and languages and peoples, was shaped in part by these journeys. It is a reminder that migration has always been part of the human story. We move when we must. We search for safety, for food, for hope. Sometimes it brings conflict, sometimes renewal, but always it leaves its mark. The great migrations of the Sea Peoples were a turning point. They ended the world of the Bronze Age and opened the door to the Iron Age. They toppled kingdoms, but they also created new ones. They spread fear, but also knowledge. Their ships carried not just destruction, but the seeds of the future. The horizon was never still. New sails always appeared. The waves carried the voices of people who refused to vanish. They searched for land, for belonging, for life itself. And in their search, they reshaped the world. The migrations were not the end. They were the beginning of something new. And as we follow their
Close your eyes and imagine the sound of drums echoing across the shoreline. Deep, heavy, thunderous. Each strike shakes the ground. The sea is restless, waves crashing harder as if answering the call. On the cliffs above, fires burn, smoke curling into the night sky. Warriors lift their spears, their bronze helmets glinting red in the firelight. Women chant, children watch with wide, unblinking eyes. The smell of salt, sweat, and burning incense fills the air. This is not a battle. It is a prayer, a plea to the gods. For the Sea Peoples did not sail into the unknown with only weapons and courage. They carried with them faith, fierce, unshakable faith in gods of war and sea. Religion for them was not quiet. It was not a whispered prayer before sleep. It was thunder, fire, sacrifice. It was the belief that storms, victory, and survival all depended on the unseen powers that ruled the waves and the battlefield. Think of the lives they lived. Every day was a gamble with death. A sudden storm could destroy their fleet. A failed harvest could starve their children. A battle lost could wipe out their tribe. In a world so fragile, their gods were not distant ideals. They were living forces, demanding respect, demanding offerings, demanding loyalty. But who were these gods?
That is where the mystery deepens. The sea peoples left no written records, no sacred texts for us to read. Their faith must be pieced together like a puzzle through fragments of archaeology, echoes in myth, and the memories of the lands they touched. Some carried gods from the Aegean, the storm gods, the earth mothers, the lords of the sea. Others worshipped deities linked to Anatolia or Cyprus, figures of fertility, harvest, and war. Still others absorbed the gods of Canaan and Egypt as they settled new lands. Their faith was not a single story, but a tide, shifting, blending, reshaping with every journey. Archaeologists uncover hints, small clay figurines of women with wide hips, symbols of fertility and life. Carved idols of bulls, strong and unyielding, sacred to storm gods. Stone anchors found near temples, linking seafaring with divine protection. Pottery painted with spirals and waves, perhaps symbols of the endless sea. Each artifact whispers of a world where every action was tied to worship. And then there is war. The gods of war walked with them. Warriors carved symbols into their blades and shields, believing the mark would grant them strength. Before battle, they made sacrifices, grain, animals, and sometimes more. The ground ran with blood, not only from enemies, but from offerings meant to win divine favor. Can you see it? The night before a great raid. Fires burn along the beach. Priests dressed in feathered cloaks chant into the darkness. The warriors kneel, heads bowed. In the center a bull is led forward, its eyes rolled, nostrils flaring as the priest raises a bronze blade. The air is tense, silent, until the strike comes. Blood spills onto the sand. The crowd erupts in chants. The gods have received their gift. The warriors rise, their hearts pounding, ready for the dawn. It may sound brutal to us, but for them it was survival. To go into battle without the gods was unthinkable. To sail without prayer was foolishness. They believed the sea was alive, an endless, hungry force. To cross it safely, they had to appease the powers within it. They offered sacrifices before setting sail. They poured wine into the waves, whispering for calm waters. They carved symbols of fish, birds, and spirals onto their ships, turning every vessel into a floating temple. Even storms became holy. Imagine being caught in the middle of the sea, waves taller than your mast, the wind howling like a beast. The crew cries out to their gods, begging for mercy. If they survive, it is proof the gods have blessed them. If they perish, it is the gods who have claimed them. The line between faith and fear was thin, blurred, constant. The sea peoples carried this devotion wherever they went. When they settled in Canaan, their faith merged with local beliefs. The Peliset, remembered as the Philistines, adopted worship of Dagon, a god of grain and the sea. Temples were built, sacrifices offered, rituals carried out beneath the same sun that had watched them cross the waves. Their gods evolved, but the heart of their worship remained the same. Survival through strength, survival through faith.
In Sardinia, the Sheridan left behind stone towers called nuraghe that might have doubled as places of defense and worship. High above the land, they prayed to gods of storm and war, the wind carrying their chants across the hills. In Cyprus, new sanctuaries rose after old cities burned. Even in Egypt, captured warriors from the sea peoples became mercenaries, their gods traveling with them, whispered in foreign lands. Religion was not just ritual, it was identity. To the sea peoples, their gods traveled with them, even when their homelands were lost. Imagine the comfort of carrying a small idol in your hand as you flee burning cities. Imagine whispering the same prayer your grandmother once spoke, even as you step onto a foreign shore. Faith was their anchor, their memory, their one unbroken thread in a world of chaos. And it was also their weapon. Belief in divine backing made their warriors fearless. They charged into battle, convinced the gods marched beside them. To their enemies, it must have felt like facing a storm made flesh, warriors who seemed unstoppable, their chants rising above the clash of weapons. The gods of war gave them not only courage, but unity. A people scattered by migration could be bound together by faith. We can almost hear those chants today. The crackling of fire, the pounding of drums, the cries of warriors before battle. The sea peoples carried the sea within their songs, the storm within their prayers. Every raid, every voyage, every settlement was soaked in ritual. Their gods were as restless as the waves, as fierce as the blade, as unyielding as the will to survive. But here is the haunting truth. While their gods gave them strength, those same gods could not save the old world. Cities still burned, kingdoms still collapsed. Their prayers did not stop the famine or the earthquakes or the endless wars. Their faith carried them forward, yes, but it could not shield them from the tide of history. But traces of their gods linger. In myths of storm deities, in stories of half-forgotten sea gods, in the ruins of temples scattered across the Mediterranean. Their gods of lore and sea still whisper to us through broken pottery and carved stone. They remind us of a people who lived on the edge of survival, who prayed with fire and blood, who saw divinity in every wave and every battle.
The sea is calm tonight. The moon casts silver across the waves, and the wind pushes gently at the sails. From the deck of a ship, you can hear the creak of wood, the snap of ropes, and the splash of water against the hull. The air smells of salt and tar, mixed with the faint sweetness of spices stored below deck. This is not a war fleet. This is a lifeline, a vessel of trade carrying treasures from one world to another. But in this calm lies power. Trade was the hidden weapon of the ancient world. It was the blood that pumped through the heart of civilizations, the thread that tied empires together, and the sea peoples knew it. They were not just raiders and warriors. They were sailors, merchants, navigators of the great trade winds. With every voyage, they carried more than goods. They carried influence, ideas, and the power to reshape history. Before the storms of invasion, before the burning cities,
The Mediterranean was a giant marketplace. Ships sailed in every direction, loaded with grain, copper, tin, wine, oil, ivory, and glass. Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenae, Cyprus, all were connected by these watery highways. To control trade was to control destiny. And no one understood this more than the sea peoples. They had grown up on the water, their lives bound to the tides. For them, the sea was not a barrier, but a road. It connected distant shores, brought wealth, and offered escape from famine. Where others feared the open waters, they embraced them. Their ships were faster, their crews more daring, their knowledge of wind and current unmatched. Imagine a convoy of their ships cutting across the waves. The hulls are low and sleek, built for speed and maneuverability. The sails catch the wind, while oars dip in rhythm, driving the vessels forward. On board are jars of oil, bundles of grain, hides of cattle, and ingots of copper. At the stern, a warrior sits with his spear, keeping watch for rivals or pirates. These are not simple fishermen. They are seafaring entrepreneurs, risking their lives for trade and survival. The cargo they carried was more valuable than gold. Bronze, the lifeblood of the age, required copper and tin. Without trade, there was no bronze, no weapons, no tools, no palaces. The sea peoples knew where to find it and how to move it. Cyprus, rich in copper, became a crucial prize. Tin, rarer still, flowed from distant lands. Control these routes, and you held power in your hands. But trade was more than metal. It was culture. With every voyage, the sea peoples exchanged not just goods, but ideas. Pottery styles from the Aegean showed up in Canaan. Egyptian jewelry appeared in Cyprus. Spices from the east scented homes in the west. Languages mixed, stories blended, gods traveled from one coast to another. The Mediterranean became a great melting pot, stirred by the winds of trade. The sea peoples thrived in this world because they understood the balance between commerce and force. One day, they might arrive as merchants, smiling, offering jars of oil in exchange for grain. The next, they might return as raiders, seizing what they could not trade for. To their rivals, this made them dangerous and unpredictable. But to the sea peoples, it was simply survival. Picture the bustling port of Ugarit in its prime. The docks are crowded with ships. Sailors shout in dozens of languages. Donkeys clatter along stone streets, their backs loaded with goods. The air is alive with smells: fresh fish, burning incense, the sharp tang of bronze. Now, imagine a group of sea peoples entering the marketplace. Their hair is braided, their helmets decorated with feathers. They carry themselves with the confidence of men who know the sea better than the land. Merchants eye them nervously, unsure if today they come as buyers or as thieves. That tension between trade and raid was the essence of their power. The Egyptians understood this well. Their reliefs depict not only battles with the sea peoples, but also their use as mercenaries and traders. At times, Pharaoh allowed them to settle, to bring their knowledge of ships and navigation into Egyptian service. Even the mightiest empire could not ignore the skills of a people who commanded the trade winds. And those winds were no small thing.
The Mediterranean was treacherous, with shifting currents, sudden storms, and long stretches of open sea. Yet the sea peoples mastered it. They learned how to ride the seasonal winds, how to time their voyages with the stars, how to navigate by the color of the water and the flight of seabirds. To outsiders, the sea was dangerous. To them, it was home. Think about what that means. While kings built their palaces on land, the sea peoples carried their power in motion. Their wealth was not stored in temples, but in the holds of ships. Their armies were not tied to cities, but to fleets. Their reach was not limited by walls, but extended to every shore they touched. This mobility made them almost impossible to defeat. Even when beaten on land, they could always retreat to the sea, regroup, and return. This made them both admired and feared. To smaller communities, they were allies, bringing goods and protection. To great empires, they were rivals, uncontrollable and dangerous. Their power lay not in conquering vast territories, but in controlling the flow of trade, the lifeblood of the ancient world. Archaeology tells us their fingerprints are everywhere. Philistine pottery in Canaan shows Aegean designs. Shirden helmets appear in Sardinia and Corsica. Weapons of foreign style turn up in Egypt. Each artifact is a reminder that the sea peoples were not bound to one place, but spread across the sea, carried by trade. They were like the wind itself, unseen but always felt. One day they might be in Cyprus, the next in Sicily, the next on the shores of Canaan. No city was safe, no port untouched. Their movements were as unpredictable as the tides. Yet trade was not only about power, it was about survival. Remember, these were not just warriors, they were families. They needed food, shelter, materials to rebuild. Trade was the bridge between destruction and life. When famine struck, they sought grain. When cities burned, they salvaged what they could. Every voyage carried the hope of stability, even if only for a season. The children of the sea peoples grew up in this world. To them, the sea was a classroom, the market a battlefield. They learned to haggle, to sail, to fight. Their lullabies were the crash of waves, their toys carved from traded ivory, their meals flavored with spices from distant lands. They were born into motion, raised by trade winds, destined to carry their people forward. But like all power, this came with risk. The same winds that carried them to wealth could carry them into danger. Rivals fought for control of trade routes. Storms destroyed entire fleets, and empires grew jealous of their influence. The sea peoples walked a fine line, balancing survival on the edge of opportunity and disaster. Still, they endured because they understood something timeless. Trade is power. Whoever controls the flow of goods controls the destiny of nations. This was their secret. This was their strength.
The drums of war echo across the Mediterranean. The sea, once a highway of trade and survival, now churns with fleets prepared for battle. Smoke rises from distant coastlines. Cities are scarred, palaces lie in ruins, and the balance of the ancient world trembles on a knife's edge. On one side stand the sea peoples, born of the waves, fierce and desperate, carrying their families, their weapons, and their dreams of new lands. On the other side, the last great empire still holding the line, Egypt, the kingdom of Pharaoh, the land of gods and kings. This is not just a battle for survival, it is a clash of civilizations, a moment when cultures, empires, and destinies collide in fire and blood, and the outcome will reshape the world forever. The stage was set at the dawn of the 12th century BCE. Across the Mediterranean, kingdoms were falling like dominoes. The Hittites, once masters of Anatolia, collapsed under famine, rebellion, and attack. Ugarit, a jewel of trade and culture, was reduced to ash. The palaces of Mycenae were looted and abandoned. Everywhere chaos reigned. And in the heart of this storm sailed the sea peoples. To their enemies, they were destroyers. To themselves, they were survivors, searching for a place to settle, pushed by hunger and pulled by opportunity. Their fleets grew larger, their raids more ambitious, but now their eyes turned south, toward the wealth of the Nile. Egypt was still standing, though not unshaken. Pharaoh Ramses III ruled with the weight of history behind him. He knew his kingdom had survived for centuries because it controlled the land, the river, and the sea. And he knew that if Egypt fell, the light of the old world might be extinguished forever. The clash began not with armies, but with movement. Picture the fleets of the sea peoples advancing across the waters. Their ships are low and swift, their sails swelling with the trade winds. Each deck is crowded with warriors in bronze, women clutching children, oxen tied for the journey, wagons stacked high with belongings. This is not a raiding party. It is a migration, a nation on the move, carrying everything they own toward a new destiny. Now, picture the Egyptians preparing. On the shores of the Nile Delta, soldiers dig trenches and fortify walls. Archers string their bows. War chariots wait in the shadows, their horses restless, snorting in the hot wind. Pharaoh commands from the center, his presence both political and divine. The people of Egypt have seen invaders before, but never like this. This is not a single army. It is a tide of people sweeping forward with the force of desperation. The Battle of the Nile Delta is one of the most vivid scenes carved into Egyptian stone. On the walls of Medinet Habu, Ramses III had his scribes immortalize the moment of truth. You can almost hear it, the roar of the sea, the shouts of warriors, the crash of oars. Egyptian ships wait in ambush, their decks crowded with archers. As the sea people's vessels push into the river mouths, the Egyptians unleash a storm of arrows. Spears fly, shields clash, men cry out in pain. Ships grind together, locked in deadly embrace. Some capsize, their crews pulled beneath the waves. Others are boarded, turning the decks into bloody arenas. The chaos is overwhelming. Bronze flashes in the sun, water turns red, and the air is filled with the smell of sweat, salt, and iron. On land, Egyptian soldiers rush to contain those who make it ashore. Chariots charge, cutting through lines of desperate fighters. The ground trembles beneath the wheels, the cries of battle rising above the clash of metal. Ramses III himself claimed victory. In his inscriptions, he declares how he crushed the invaders, how the sea peoples were cast down and trampled. He boasts that Egypt alone stood firm while the rest of the world crumbled. And in part, this is true. The sea peoples were defeated at the Delta. They did not conquer Egypt. They did not burn Thebes or topple the pharaoh's throne. But victory came at a cost. The battles strained Egypt's resources. Grain was scarce, treasuries emptying, temples demanding offerings that Pharaoh could barely supply. The sea peoples may not have destroyed Egypt, but they wounded it, and that wound would never fully heal. The clash was more than military. It was cultural. It was the meeting of two ways of life, one rooted in land, stability, and tradition, the other born of movement, sea, and survival. Egypt represented the weight of history, the continuity of the old gods, the order of temples and dynasties. The sea peoples represented disruption, mobility, the hunger of those who had nothing left to lose. This tension echoed far beyond the battlefield. In the Levant, new cultures rose where old ones had fallen. Among them were the Philistines, believed to be descendants of the sea peoples who survived. Their pottery, their weapons, even their diet carried traces of Aegean influence. They became both neighbors and rivals to the Israelites, leaving a mark on the biblical record itself. So what really happened in this clash? Did the sea peoples lose? Yes and no. They did not topple Egypt, but they carved out new homes on the coasts of Canaan and beyond. They did not erase the pharaohs, but they helped usher in a new age where no empire held total control of the sea. The Mediterranean became more fragmented, its power centers smaller, its networks reshaped. Egypt survived, but it was no longer the shining giant of old. The sea peoples endured, but as settlers, not conquerors. Both sides were changed forever by the meeting. Now, imagine standing on the Nile Delta in the aftermath. The battlefield is quiet, save for the cries of gulls and the lapping of waves. Broken ships drift on the current, their sails torn, their hulls splintered. The sand is littered with bronze weapons, shattered shields, and the footprints of men who will never return. Smoke from burning villages drifts on the horizon. The clash is over, but its shadow lingers. The world has changed. The Bronze Age, with its great palaces and empires, is breathing its last. In its place will rise a new world, smaller kingdoms, new cultures, and the beginnings of nations that still echo in our history today. The clash of civilizations was not the end. It was the turning of the page. And so the sea peoples leave the stage, not as conquerors of Egypt, but as reshapers of the Mediterranean. Their ships still sail in memory, their names still carved in stone. They were raiders, yes, but also survivors, migrants, and creators of new cultures. Egypt still stands, but no longer as unchallenged ruler of the waves. The sea has shifted, and with it, history itself. The winds of trade had carried them, the storms of war had tested them, And now the world they left behind would never be the same. Next comes the age of ashes and rebirth. The cities that burned, the palaces that fell, would give way to new societies. The old gods would fade, and new stories would rise. Out of the clash of civilizations, a new world was being born.
The horizon darkened with sails. For the people on shore, it must have felt like watching a storm roll in, unstoppable, merciless, and alive. The sea itself seemed to carry an army upon its back, ship after ship gliding toward the coast. The sound of drums echoed across the waves, mixing with the cries of gulls and the roar of the surf. For those who saw it, the message was clear. The end had come. This was the last invasion, the final push of the sea peoples, the moment when the tide of migration and conquest reached its peak. Cities had already burned, empires had already fallen, but this was different. This was not just another raid, it was a decisive strike, the gamble that would determine the future of the Mediterranean world. The year was around 1177 BCE. Egypt, battered and bruised, was the last great power left standing. To the north, the Hittite Empire was gone. The palaces of Greece lay in ruins. Cyprus, once a hub of trade, was smoldering. The Levant had been ravaged. The old order had collapsed, and only Pharaoh's kingdom remained. If Egypt fell, there would be nothing left of the Bronze Age world. And so the Sea Peoples came. They had already carved footholds in the Levant, settling along the coastlines of Canaan. But now their eyes turned once more to the richest prize of all, the fertile Nile Delta, the breadbasket of the ancient world. For a migrating people, desperate for land and survival, Egypt represented not just wealth, but permanence. Pharaoh Ramses III knew what was coming. His spies had brought word of enemy fleets gathering, of tribes uniting under a single cause. The Sea Peoples were not coming as scattered raiders. They were coming as a coalition, a confederation of nations bound together by desperation and hope. They brought their warriors, their families, their wagons, even their herds of cattle. This was not just an army, it was a people on the move. Picture it. The beaches of the Nile Delta, the sun blazing overhead, the air heavy with heat and tension. Egyptian soldiers stand ready, their bows strung, their shields raised. Chariots wait in the shadows, horses stamping the earth, nostrils flaring in the dust. Priests chant prayers to the gods, calling on Ra, on Amun, on every power in heaven to defend the land. And beyond the horizon, the sails appear, rows of ships advancing like a floating city, their prows sharp, their warriors shouting as they draw near. The clash that followed was one of the most dramatic battles of the ancient world. Egyptian reliefs carved into the walls of Medinet Habu still tell the story. They show ships colliding, archers raining down arrows, warriors locked in hand-to-hand combat. The sea was filled with wreckage and screams, the water turning red as bodies fell beneath the waves. On land, the invaders who reached the shore were met with a storm of chariots, their lines shattered by the speed and force of Pharaoh's army. The battle raged through day and night, a desperate struggle for survival on both sides. For the Sea Peoples, it was their final,
all-or-nothing strike. For Egypt, it was a fight for existence. The cries of war mixed with the roar of the river, the clash of bronze against bronze, the thud of arrows striking shields. The air was thick with the smell of blood, sweat, and burning pitch. And then it ended. Ramses III declared victory. His inscriptions boast of the destruction of the enemy, of ships sunk and warriors slain, of entire tribes scattered to the winds. The sea peoples, he claimed, were crushed, their hopes shattered against the might of Egypt. The walls of his temple stand as a monument to that triumph, a reminder that Pharaoh had stood against the storm and lived. But victory was not as clear as the carvings suggest. Yes, Egypt survived. The invaders did not conquer the Nile. The heart of the kingdom remained untouched, but Egypt was weakened, its treasury drained, its people exhausted. The war had taken its toll, and though the sea peoples failed to seize Egypt itself, they did not vanish. Many settled along the coastlines of the Levant, in territories that would later be known as Philistine. From there they became a force that would shape the stories of the Bible, clashing with early Israelite tribes remembered for generations as fierce and formidable foes. So, what made this invasion the last? The truth is, the sea peoples had reached their limit. They had burned cities, toppled empires, and shaken the ancient world to its core. But at Egypt, they met resistance strong enough to halt their advance. The Nile Delta was their final frontier. From this point on, their power would fade, not in a single moment, but gradually, as they settled into the lands they had won and lost, the momentum of constant conquest. The old world had already collapsed. The sea peoples had played their part in that destruction. But with the failure of the last invasion, the age of fire and storms came to an end. What remained was something quieter, more enduring, the slow birth of a new world. Imagine walking the battlefield afterward. The Nile Delta is littered with broken ships, their sails torn, their prows jutting from the sand like bones. The bodies of warriors lie scattered along the shore, bronze weapons still clutched in their hands. The cries of widows and children echo through the camps. The smoke of battle drifts on the wind, mingling with the scent of river reeds and salt. The invasion is over, but the memory will never fade. For the Egyptians, it was proof that their gods still protected them. For the sea peoples, it was the end of their great journey, the last desperate attempt to claim the world by fire and sword. In their failure, the shape of the future was sealed. And yet the story does not end here. The sea peoples may have been stopped, but the Bronze Age world was already gone. The great empires of old lay in ruins. Trade networks had collapsed. Writing systems disappeared. For centuries, the Mediterranean entered a dark age, where memory itself was broken. Out of that silence, new cultures would rise. The Greeks of the classical age, the Israelites of the Bible, the Phoenicians who carried trade into distant lands.
The desert remembers.
The sea forgets, but the sand holds its secrets forever. Step into the ruins of the Bronze Age world and you will hear them. Whispers carried by the wind, echoes of voices long gone. They speak of fire and ships, of kings brought low, of a storm that rose from the sea and changed history forever. The world of the sea peoples has vanished, yet their shadows stretch across time. You may not see their faces, you may not know their names, but their echoes still linger in the stones, in the stories, in the silence of forgotten cities. This is the legacy of the sea peoples, a legacy written not in monuments or records, but in the ashes of empires and the birth of something new. Imagine standing in the ruins of Ugarit. The once great city is silent now. Its walls are broken, its temples collapsed. The harbor where ships once bustled with trade lies empty, the waters calm as glass. But beneath your feet, buried in the sand, are letters scratched onto clay tablets. Letters that tell of panic, of kings begging for help as the sea peoples drew near. The enemy ships are approaching, one tablet reads. The city is lost. That cry written more than 3,000 years ago is still here, frozen in time, preserved by the fire that destroyed it. This is how the sea peoples speak to us today, not in their own words, but in the desperate voices of those who face them. We do not know their true names. The Egyptians called them by fragments: Shurdan, Peliset, Shekelish, Luka. We do not know what they called themselves, what songs they sang, what gods they prayed to. Their story is not written in books or scrolls, but in destruction layers buried beneath centuries of dust. And yet, from these fragments, we piece together their world. A world of wandering fleets, of migrations across the sea, of hunger and hope driving entire nations to risk everything for survival. Perhaps that is why their memory lingers so powerfully, because in them we see something universal: the struggle to endure, the will to survive even when the world collapses around you. Their legacy is not only in ruins, but also in rebirth. The collapse of the Bronze Age was devastating. Trade routes vanished, writing systems fell silent, knowledge was lost. But from the ashes, new cultures emerged. The Phoenicians rose to dominate the seas, building an empire of trade that reached as far as Spain. The Israelites, their earliest struggle shaped in part by encounters with the Philistines, descendants of the Sea Peoples, began to carve their story into history. Greece, plunged into darkness after the fall of Mycenae, would one day rise again to light the world with philosophy, theater, and democracy. The Sea Peoples were both destroyers and midwives, tearing down the old while clearing space for the new. Even in Egypt, their shadow lingered. Ramses III won the battle, yes, but his victory came at a cost. The wealth of Egypt drained away, its power weakened, its glory dimmed. The Sea Peoples did not conquer the Nile, but they marked the beginning of its slow decline. Egypt would never again command the world as it once had. So who truly won? History rarely gives us simple answers. The Sea Peoples did not create empires, yet they erased them. They did not leave monuments, yet they reshaped the map. Their names may be lost, but their impact was so great that even 3,000 years later, we are still trying to understand them. Close your eyes and picture them, not as faceless invaders, but as people. A woman clutching her child as she boards a ship. A warrior sharpening his blade, knowing tomorrow may bring death. A family piling their belongings into a wagon, leaving behind the graves of their ancestors for a future unknown. They were not demons or legends. They were human beings caught in the storms of history. And maybe that is why their story still haunts us, because in their journey, we see our own reflection. How far would we go to protect our families? What risks would we take when the land fails, when hunger drives us, when the world we know collapses? Walk through the Levant today and you can still hear their echoes. In the cities of the Philistines, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gaza, the stones bear traces of a people whose roots stretched back across the sea. Their pottery, their architecture, even the foods they introduced all whisper of a migration that reshaped the region. Archaeologists dig and uncover traces of a lost identity, Aegean designs, foreign tools, strange burial customs. The Sea Peoples did not disappear. They blended. They transformed. They left behind fragments of themselves woven into new cultures. Every shard, every broken wall, every buried skeleton is an echo, a reminder that they were here. The sands of time are merciless. Empires rise, empires fall. Cities are buried, names are forgotten, yet the Sea Peoples remain, not as clear figures, but as questions. Who were they truly? Where did they come from? What drove them to burn the world behind them? Historians argue still, piecing together clues like detectives at a crime scene. Some say they came from the Aegean, driven by famine and war. Others see them as exiles from Anatolia, refugees turned conquerors. The truth may be many truths at once, a confederation of tribes, bound together not by blood, but by desperation. Perhaps that is why their memory lingers so powerfully, because in them we see something universal, the mystery itself. They remind us how fragile history is, how easily stories can vanish, leaving only silence behind. But silence is not empty. Silence carries echoes. Listen closely and you will hear the roar of waves against wooden hulls, the crackle of burning cities, the clash of bronze swords. You will hear the cries of victory, the wails of loss, the prayers of both invader and defender. These sounds are carried not only in ruins, but in us, in the stories we tell, in the questions we ask, in the endless search for meaning. The Sea Peoples are gone, but their echoes are everywhere. Now picture the desert once more. The wind sweeps across dunes, carrying sand that buries temples and uncovers bones. The sun sets over broken walls, casting long shadows across the ruins of forgotten cities. Somewhere in that silence, if you listen closely, you can almost hear them. The creak of a ship, the murmur of a voice, the faint echo of a life once lived. The Sea Peoples are not truly gone. They live in memory, in legend, in the echoes of the sand. Their story reminds us that history is not just about kings and empires, but about people, ordinary men and women caught in extraordinary times. And as we leave this journey, as we step away from the fires and the battles, we carry their echoes with us. Whispers of a time when the world ended and a new one began. The echoes fade, the sand shifts, and the sea is quiet once more. The story of the Sea Peoples is complete, but the mystery remains, waiting for the next traveler, the next dreamer, the next listener to hear the whispers hidden in the waves and the sand.
Imagine a world where the greatest cities lie in ruins. Palaces that once glowed with gold now stand hollow and broken. The voices of kings, scribes, and merchants have gone silent. And in their place, only shadows remain.
shadows of people we cannot fully see, yet whose hands shaped the destiny of an age. The Sea Peoples. Their names lost, their faces erased, but their impact carved deep into history. This is not the story of their rise, nor of their battles. This is the story of what they left behind. A legacy written not in monuments, but in silence. Not in glory, but in shadows. Walk with me now. Imagine stepping into the ruins of Hattusa, once the capital of the mighty Hittite Empire. The walls are cracked. The gates that once roared with chariots are empty. You hear only the sound of the wind pushing through broken stones. No records tell us the exact moment of their fall, but the silence itself is their monument. The Sea Peoples did not build. They erased. And in that erasure, they gave birth to something new. The shadows they left behind became the foundation for the Iron Age. Out of the wreckage, new cultures emerged, carrying fragments of the old. Think of Egypt. Ramses III fought them, recorded his victory in stone, and claimed to have broken their power. But victory is not always what it seems. Egypt survived, yes, but the cracks deepened. The wealth that once flowed like a river slowed to a trickle. Pharaohs grew weaker, priests grew stronger, and the great empire slipped into decline. The Sea Peoples did not conquer Egypt, but they planted the shadow of its end. It's a reminder. Sometimes the most lasting legacy is not in what is created, but in what is undone. And then, the Philistines. They may have been among the Sea Peoples, settling on the southern coast of Canaan. Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gaza, Gath, cities that would rise and fall again in the centuries to come. Archaeologists dig into their lairs and find echoes of the Aegean. Strange pottery styles, new foods, foreign gods. They were not just destroyers. They were also settlers. Their culture became part of the fabric of the land, woven into the struggles and stories of ancient Israel. Their shadows became seeds, seeds of conflict, seeds of identity, seeds of legend. Now picture the Phoenicians. In the chaos left behind, they rose from the ashes like a phoenix, masters of trade, masters of ships. They spread across the Mediterranean, founding colonies that would one day include Carthage. Did they rise because the Sea Peoples cleared the seas for them? Perhaps. The old empires that once dominated trade had fallen silent. Into that silence, the Phoenicians sailed. The shadows left by destruction became open waters for new dreams. Every shadow is also a doorway. But the greatest legacy of the Sea Peoples is not simply political or cultural. It is the mystery. We do not know their origin for certain. We do not know their true names, their language, or their story. And yet, their shadows haunt us. Scholars debate, archaeologists dig, storytellers imagine. In their absence, they have become larger than life, symbols of chaos, of migration, of survival against impossible odds. They are like a ghost that never fades, a whisper that never dies.
Their legacy is the question itself. Now close your eyes. Hear the sound of waves breaking against wooden holes. Smell the salt carried on the wind. See the fire on the horizon as cities burn. And then, silence. Only the shadows remain. This is how their story comes to us, not whole, not clear, but broken fragments. It is like standing before a shattered mirror where each piece reflects a part of the truth, but never the whole. And maybe that is the lesson. History is not always complete. Sometimes it is written in shadows. What do we learn from them? That civilizations are fragile, that the seas can bring both trade and terror, that hunger and hope can drive entire peoples to leave behind their homes, their gods, their graves, and cast themselves into the unknown. We learn that history is not just about empires rising in glory, but also about what happens when the tide turns and the walls fall. The Sea Peoples remind us that shadows last longer than sunlight. Sunlight fades. Shadows endure. Look to the ruins scattered across the Mediterranean. From Troy to Ugarit, from Cyprus to Canaan, the same story repeats: fire, silence, rebuilding. And yet through it all, the human spirit endured. The survivors built anew. They found ways to adapt, to create, to carry forward what could be saved. That is part of the Sea People's legacy too. Not just destruction, but resilience. They forced the world to change, and in that change, humanity proved its strength. The shadows are not only warnings, they are also lessons in survival. Think of today. Wars still rage. Migrations still reshape nations. Refugees still sail across seas, leaving behind everything they knew. In the story of the Sea Peoples, we see echoes of our own world. The shadows they left remind us that history repeats, not in the same way, but in the same patterns. Hunger, fear, hope, desperation. They are as old as humanity itself. Their story is not just ancient history, it is our story too. The desert holds their silence. The sea hides their secrets. And yet, their legacy still lives, woven into myths, into scriptures, to the birth of new nations. They were destroyers, settlers, survivors, strangers. They were shadows, and shadows never truly die. When we walk through ruins, when we hold a broken shard of pottery, when we read a desperate letter baked into clay, we are not just studying history. We are listening to whispers. Whispers carried across 3,000 years. The Sea People speak not in words, but in echoes. So here we stand at the end of their story. A story of mystery, fire, and shadows. A story that shaped the ancient world and left behind questions we may never fully answer. But maybe that is the point. Not all stories are meant to be solved. Some are meant to be felt, Some are meant to remind us that even in silence there is meaning. The sea peoples vanished into the waves of time, but their shadows stretch into our present and perhaps into our future.